You think you know the history of France. Versailles, where sunlight danced on golden walls, where kings ruled with elegance, opulence, and divine right. But there are things history books dare not whisper. No one tells you that deep within that glittering palace, behind sealed doors and beneath polished marble, there once lived a royal prince, who descended into madness and fed on human flesh, not from hunger, not from desperation, but from something darker, older, a madness that devoured not just his mind, but the bloodline of kings. Tonight's story isn't legend, it's a scar buried deep beneath France's royal history, a scar that bleeds still, a name Now, if you're ready to step into the dark with us to uncover the truths history tried to bury, to hear the whispers beneath the crown, subscribe to Historical Darkness, because here, we don't just tell history, we resurrect it. In the heart of Versailles, beneath the golden glory, the stench of rot was inescapable. It clung to the silk-lined walls like breath on a crypt door, hidden behind velvet drapes and hollow smiles, a secret festered one so obscene that even the court's most vicious gossip dared not speak it aloud. They whispered instead of fits, of visions, of the king's unnatural appetites. But behind those euphemisms, behind the manic laughter and wine-stained lips, something far darker was feeding. This is not the story of Louis XIV, the Sun King, nor is it the tale of revolution or guillotines. This is the story of a forgotten monarch, a man lost between sanity and power, a ruler who allegedly dined not only on rare delicacies, but on the flesh of his own kind. They called him La Roi, the Cursed King. Today, his name has all but vanished from textbooks, erased, like an ink blot on fragile parchment, but buried in the archives of Saint Denis, in the private journals of palace physicians, and in the letters of horrified ambassadors, his legend lives on. A king who slipped so deep into madness that his court feared the night itself. A king whose meals were veiled in secrecy, whose guests sometimes never left the dining hall. But was it madness, or something more? Let us begin not with the throne, but with the soil beneath it, with a boy, fragile, pale, trembling, born into silk sheets and the suffocating pressure of a cursed crown. He was born in the early 1700s, into a France that had not yet tasted revolution, but was already choking on decadence. His name, Louis Charles d'Orléans, a cousin of the royal bloodline, close enough to the throne to matter, but distant enough to be overlooked. His father died young, crushed beneath a carriage in what some claimed was a divine punishment. His mother, a Bavarian duchess with a face carved from grief, withdrew from court life and shut the boy inside endless corridors of silence. From his earliest years, Louis Charles was not like the other noble boys. He did not laugh, he did not ride, he did not hunt. He wandered the gardens at midnight and whispered to the fountains. Servants found small bones beneath his bedbirds, rats, once even a severed cat paw. They dismissed it. Boys are strange, especially royal ones. But the rumors followed him as he aged. At 17, he inherited a vast estate in the Loire Valley. What should have been a gift became a curse. By 20, he had isolated himself entirely, feasting alone at long tables, filled with food no one else touched. He developed violent tremors and a glassy stare. Witnesses claimed he would spend hours kneeling beside a boar's carcass, muttering to it in Latin. One cook confessed, trembling, that the prince insisted his meat be served so fresh, it still bled. And then, the disappearances began. Peasants, servants, a stable boy here, a chambermaid there, always explained away. They fled, said the officials, eloped, stole silver, drowned. But one night, a noble guest vanished, a minor count from Toulouse. He'd been seen drinking heavily with the prince late into the evening, and was never seen again. His horse remained in the stable, his clothes in the chamber, and his ring worm was discovered near the kitchens. No one dared accuse a prince, but whispers began to slither through Versailles. The court was no stranger to scandal, but this was something else, something ancient. Some called it madness, others used a darker word, possession. The church quietly dispatched an exorcist, cloaked as a music tutor. He stayed for 3 days. On the 4th, he fled barefoot, bleeding and babbling about the devil's eyes hiding behind a crown. He died a week later in a monastery, tongue swollen, fingers blackened. No autopsy was permitted. The official records of Louis Charles d'Orléans are sparse. A few mentions in royal ledgers. a signature on a treaty. Then, abruptly, silence. Number death certificate, no funeral, no official portrait. It is as if France decided to pretend he never existed, but he did, and somewhere, something changed in him. Because just 10 years after his disappearance, amid a time of political confusion, a strange figure returned to court. He called himself Louis, though which Louis, no one was quite sure. He wore the robes of a king, signed edicts with royal authority, and demanded tributes of rare meat from across the provinces. His face was hidden by layers of lace and powder. His voice cracked like a man who had screamed too often and too long. But most disturbingly, he never ate in public. Banquets were held in his name. Of course, roasted swan, glazed venison, oysters, and saffron, but he never tasted them. Not in the light, at least not at night. However, the kitchens were stirred to life. Servants were forbidden from speaking. Guards were doubled. And beneath the flickering torchlight, something was being prepared. A foreign ambassador once stumbled into the wrong corridor, drawn by the metallic smell of blood. He later wrote, "I heard, chewing, not of food, but of something living, and a sob, not of fear, but of ecstasy." He left France the next day and never returned. By then, the nobles knew to look the other way. Power true, power was never questioned, especially not when it wore a crown. But in secret, they began to refer to him by another name, the Cannibal King. Not out of cruelty, but out of terror. What happened next would fracture the royal bloodline and infect the very roots of Versailles. France would face hunger, plague, and fire, and some believed it all began with a meal, a very particular kind of meal, but that comes later. France in the early 18th century was a place of gilded masks and rotting foundations. From the outside, it gleamed a diamond set in the heart of Europe, its monarchy cloaked in divine right and powdered wigs. But behind the mirrored halls of Versailles, beneath the marble floors and embroidered curtains, something darker had begun to take root. While the common people starved in the streets of Paris, watching their children waste away from bad bread and worse air, the royal court indulged in another kind of hunger, the kind that did not fill the stomach, but corrupted the soul. It was in this world, split between opulence and decay, that Louis Charles d'Orléans returned, though no one could say from where. The year was 1744. The War of the Austrian Succession raged across Europe. But inside the gates of Versailles, another war had begun, a quiet one, fought with glances, secrets, and the silent removal of anyone who asked too many questions. Louis Charles, or the man who now claimed that name, reappeared not as a prince, but as a shadow. With authority, he was granted access to state councils, offered chambers in the east wing of the palace long abandoned after a suspicious fire, and, most strangely of all, given a private retinue of mute attendants imported from an obscure corner of Hungary. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice was hoarse, as if unused for years, or ruined by something far worse than silence. His presence unsettled even the most jaded courtiers. Madame de Pompadour, mistress of the king, refused to sit in the same room as him. "He smells of the grave," she once whispered, "and there is something in his eyes that remembers pain." He did not attend mass. He did not kneel before the relics of saints or cross himself during eclipses. But most disturbingly, he never cast a reflection, at least. That's what they said. Louis Charles held strange rituals in his private quarters. The servants reported the sound of knives scraping bone, of jars breaking, screaming not loud, but muffled, always muffled, as if someone were trying very hard to scream through their skin. And yet, no one moved against him. Why? Because the King Louis XV was afraid. The two men had grown up distantly connected, their branches of the Bourbon family often interweaving through strategic marriages and suspicious deaths. As children, they had once played together in the orangery, but by adulthood, Louis XV refused to even utter his cousin's name. Some say it was guilt, others say it was fear born of knowledge, that the king knew exactly what Louis Charles had become, and dared not cross him. The east wing of Versailles soon earned a new name among the staff. They called it La Maison qui saigne, the house that bled. Every fortnight, oxen were delivered at midnight, not through the grand gates, but through a hidden passage that had once been used for royal mistresses. The beasts arrived whole. They left as bones. That, too, could have been ignored. After all, men of wealth had always indulged their tastes. What finally forced attention was the death of Jean-Baptiste Verga, a royal physician. He had been summoned to the East Wing to treat what was described as a private affliction. When he did not return by morning, his apprentice sounded the alarm. Guards were dispatched, but the door to Louis Charles's chambers had been sealed from the inside, with thick iron nails that it took 5 men and a battering ram to breach it. Inside, they found the physician, or what was left of him. His hands were gone. His ribcage cracked open like a book. His eyes boiled in their sockets. But strangest of all was the table set for wine, bread, fruit, and a carefully arranged plate where Duverger's heart had once rested. That moment changed everything. The court could no longer pretend this was just rumor. An emergency session was held. The king was reportedly inconsolable. But when they sent soldiers to arrest Louis Charles, they found the East Wing completely empty. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no bodies, just a faint coppery odor and a single note written in Latin. Quod incepit, finiet, what has begun, shall be finished. 4 years afterward, Versailles was haunted not by ghosts, but by silence. No one would walk the East Wing. Its windows were boarded, its doors sealed with wax and prayer. But Louis Charles was never captured. Instead, he became a shadow haunting the edges of royal gatherings. Sightings in mirrors, whispers in cellars, a servant's scream in the dark before their throat was slit from behind. Some say he had begun to change, that his skin was hardening, that his eyes reflected torchlight even when unlit, that his body no longer needed rest, or air, or even warmth. One stable boy, driven mad by what he saw, described a man with no mouth, but still chewing. And so, the dynasty began to crumble. Louis XV grew paranoid, withdrawn. He cancelled court appearances. He stopped eating publicly. He was said to weep in his sleep and mutter about sins that feed themselves. His death came suddenly, during a hunting trip, a seizure, the official report said. But his body was buried without ceremony. His coffin nailed shut. Louis XVI inherited more than the crown. He inherited a curse. By the time the revolution swept through France, the people weren't just hungry, they were furious, and perhaps haunted. The mob stormed Versailles in 1789, but when they reached the East Wing, they found nothing. The rooms were gone. The entire structure had collapsed inward decades earlier in a mysterious fire, ash and ruin. Nothing more, but beneath the floorboards, archaeologists in the 1960s discovered a series of tunnels. Inside those tunnels, bones. Human, dozens, maybe hundreds, some with teeth marks, not from animals, from something else. But we're not ready for that part yet. First, you must understand what happened when Louis Charles was forced from the palace. He didn't die. He wandered, and his appetites only grew stronger. He had not been seen in the light of day for years. But the hunger, whatever it was, did not sleep. It prowled. It prowled like a beast wearing the skin of a man. Louis Charles wandered the fractured countryside, a phantom in fine rags. Towns whispered his name as a curse whispered around hearths. La roi maudit. Mothers clutched their children and pulled them beneath the tables when his shadow fell across the road. He no longer needed the trappings of rule. He had something more intimate, now something fed, not by tribute, but by blood-bound ritual. The first of the unspeakable incidents began in a small town in the Loire, where rumors had spread of a traveling noble who offered wealth for silence and, once accepted, demanded a strange harvest. He arrived with a retinue of pale, silent attendants. He chose his victims not by rank or wealth, but by their eyes, those who still reflected light, who held the ember of life in them. He took the village priest first. Father Guillaume had been a soft-spoken man, beloved by his flock. On a rain-drenched evening, Louis Charles appeared at the church door wearing a burial veil. He invited the priest to dine for the sake of confession. The villagers, grateful that the cursed noble sought absolution, watched as the priest entered the carriage and was driven away. 3 days later, a feast was announced. The entire town was summoned to the manor, with the promise of medicine, bread, and protection from the famine tightening like a noose beyond their gates. They came hungry, hopeful. They were seated around a long cedar table. Candles flickered, casting their faces into wavering relief. The noble, the king, sat at the head, eyes sunken, a faint phosphorescent sheen under his skin. He raised a goblet, filled with wine so dark it reflected no light. When the first course arrived, a hush fell. Roasted fowl glazed with honey, stews thick and fragrant, The villagers, desperate enough to swallow anything, began to eat. Then came the second course, a slow procession of dishes carved from the finest silver. White meat tender, seasoned with herbs so rare that the scent made throats ache. It was accompanied by a small paper on each plate, written in an elegant trembling hand, "For the forgiveness of sins, taste the flesh of one who carried your prayers." The villagers looked around, horrified. The paper bore the priest's sealed out no. One spoke. The noble, with the gentlest of gestures, lifted a knife and carved his own portion. He chewed deliberately, savoring. The silence in the hall shifted. It was no longer hunger in the air. It was reverence. After the meal, one by one, the villagers began to see something inside them had gone hollow. Their faith vanished like steam. They felt as if something had been taken from them, not their bodies, but their indulgence of mercy. Father Guillaume's voice, once soft and soothing, no longer echoed in prayers. He had been silenced in a way no funeral could uncover. The second shock was worse. Word reached Paris not through official channels, but through a terrified courier who arrived with his horses lathered in sweat and his mind frayed. He claimed he had seen Louis Charles in a chateau outside Tours, presiding over a royal banquet attended by nobles and commoners alike. All were under some enchantment, their pupils dilated, their hands unsteady. The banquet, the courier said, was a facade hidden beneath layers of perfumed sauces were the remains of those who had once tried to expose him. A local magistrate, an investigative scribe, and the messenger who had attempted to carry their testimonies to Versailles had disappeared in succession. Their names were spoken during toasts, and their flesh was served, disguised, to those who would have denounced him. The horrifying calculus was simple. Those who saw could be neutralized by turning their testimony into communion. By ingesting the evidence, the witness became complicit and broken. Any resistance crumpled in the face of taboo, turned into forced silence. The third incident tore through the fragile veil separating perception from truth, and brought Louis Charles's transformation into terrifying clarity. A monk scientist from the Abbey of St. Cyr, Brother Etienne, had spent years secretly compiling testimonies of the cursed king. He believed the phenomenon was not purely supernatural, that in Louis Charles's madness was an amalgam of psychological contagion, possible physiological mutation, and a dark, self-reinforcing ritual. He petitioned for access to the East Wing ruins, convinced that remnants there held the key to the king's origin and, perhaps, his undoing. He brought with him a small circle of disciples, a surgeon, a linguist versed in old court cipher, and a young woman from the provinces whose brother had vanished after confronting the king about the disappearance of the priest in Ch. They descended into the forgotten tunnels, still damp, still carrying that faint metallic tang as if the earth itself remembered the screams. At the heart of the tunnel network, beneath a collapsed arch, they found a cavern carved with marks that were both ritualistic and anatomical. Bones had been arranged in patterns. Teeth had been embedded into the walls like a grotesque mosaic. In the center, a stone altar stained dark, the grooves polished as if by 1,000 hands, and then they heard it. A slow, deliberate scraping skin against stone. A wet, muffled sound like chewing, but thick, ancient. They were not alone. From the shadowed recesses emerged a figure. He was both decayed and whole. His skin had a sheen of something neither sweat nor oil. It rippled like vellum stretched over a corpse, yet beneath it, legible veins pulsed with disturbing rhythm. His eyes reflected the torchlight with a glint that seemed to contain other faces, fragments of the people whose flesh he had consumed. His mouth was torn, not open in a wound, but in purposeful distortion. The lips had melded as if fused, yet the motion of chewing continued, soundless and relentless. Brother Etienne stepped forward, trembling, and spoke the name the king once bore. Louis Charles tilted his head not with curiosity, but with the slow patience of something that had waited for confession like a disease waits for a host. The young woman's brother's echo flickered in his eyes, then vanished. "I have been feeding," the king said. His voice carried the rasp of rusted hinges and the resonance of many lives layered within. "You came not to save, but to remember. You carry their faces. I will keep them." He lifted his hand, and from beneath his cloak produced a small heart, preserved in a crystal vial. It beat slowly, impossibly still warm. Etienne recognized the seal on the parchment wrapped around it. It belonged to the magistrate who had tried to bring word of the king's first atrocities to court. "You will understand," Louis Charles continued, that history is a meal. Consume it, and you are bound. Refuse it, and you forget. I do not take flesh for hunger, I take it for memory. To eat their hearts is to hold their secrets, to keep their debts, to make their pain immortal and thus mine. Brother Etienne, desperate, raised the surgeon's compass, an instrument of crude science, and lunged, aiming for the thing's heart. The king moved with non-human speed. In an instant the monk's wrist was locked, his fingers twisted, and the compass broke. Like twigs, the surgeon tried to intervene. The king's skin bulged, not with swelling, but with the ripple of dozens of swallowed screams, and he surged forward. The young woman screamed not with fear, but with something between recognition and surrender. He reached out, not to kill. To feed, he pressed his forehead to hers. She felt it, the lives, the names, the terror. Her own brother's final breath flooded her mind. She collapsed, eyes wide, the secret seared into her bones. And then the king withdrew. He placed a trembling hand, flesh softening, as if the intent of memory made him briefly human, over Etienne's heart. Go, he whispered. Tell them, but know this, no one will believe a man who carries the scent of what he saw. You will become what you fear. Your memory becomes my feast. And when they eat you, they will carry my silence. They fled. The young woman, broken, carried the knowledge that her brother's face lived now in a man who could not die. Brother Etienne, pale and hollowed, returned to the abbey and began scribbling feverishly pages and pages of accounts, diagrams, and warnings. Within a week, he was dead. The official verdict, fever, the monks whispered. The king took that too. In the weeks that followed, the stories spread not by court dispatches, but in the half-remembered dreams of nobles who had tasted something too bitter in their throat. When recalling the East Wing, the rumor was no longer a myth. It had a texture, it had a smell, it had a face that could be seen in mirrors, reflected sometimes twice, one face flayed beneath the other like layers of a rotten onion. This was the peak, the moment when the transformation could no longer be explained away as rumor, and the horror could no longer be contained by silence, and yet the throne above them remained. The blood-stained rituals did not end. They evolved. The king, the thing with a crown, no longer needed to hide entirely. He began to call his feasts cleansings. Noble families received invitations. Noble families received invitations to witness the renewal of lineage. Those who accepted left not only with their reputations intact, but with a piece of themselves missing, passed along in hushed gratitude. Those who refused simply vanished. It was no longer a secret. It was an infection. What would follow would tip the balance of what was remembered and what was buried. In the years that followed the blood banquets, France began to rot from the inside quietly, almost elegantly, not with fire and rebellion, not yet, but with a subtle corrosion that started where few could see it. In the noble houses, in the whispered prayers no longer answered, in the rooms once filled with music, now hushed like mausoleums. The aristocracy kept eating, the wine kept flowing, but the soul of the kingdom had gone missing, like a man taken from the table before dessert. It was as though something sacred had been inverted. The rituals of courtmen to honor tradition, God, and divine right had turned inside out. The king still held banquets, but no one spoke of the guest lists, no one admitted who was there, and no one asked why there were always more empty chairs. The next morning, Versailles became less of a palace and more of a tomb dressed in gold. There are records scattered, fragmented, half-burned that tell of these final years. In the private diaries of chambermaids, the journals of foreign envoys, the desperate letters smuggled from the kitchens, a pattern emerged. Those who remained near the king too long began to change. Not in body, at least not at first, but in memory. They forgot their names. They forgot their children. They spoke in half-sentences. They wandered the halls at night, murmuring prayers that had never been written in any Bible. One noble woman, the Duchesse de Ferron, was found weeping before a full-length mirror in her chambers. When asked what was wrong, she whispered, "He's wearing me. He looked out through my face last night." Her attendants laughed nervously. A week later, she leaped from the balcony during a midnight storm, leaving only her embroidered slippers, one turned outward, as if she had been stepping into something, not away from it. More disturbing still were the orphans, children left at the palace gates, sometimes wrapped in silks, sometimes covered in bruises, always silent. The servants who found them often reported a smell in earth and something sour. One child, a boy with grey eyes, too old for his face, spoke only once. He said, "I was deserted." Then he stopped speaking altogether. It was the summer of 1772 when the silence finally cracked. The Marquis de Launay, a minor noble with no love for Versailles but a sharp mind for patterns, began collecting reports, disappearances, madness, the feasts no one remembered attending. He traced it all back not just to the king, but to Louis Charles, who by now had assumed no official title but held a terrifying kind of influence. The Marquis travelled to Lyon, then Rouen, then back to the Abbey of Saint-Cyr, where fragments of Brother Etienne's writings had survived. There, he found something chilling, a sketch, primitive, smeared in ink, but unmistakable, a throne of bones, flanked by faces with no eyes, and beneath it, written in trembling Latin, Cor Regis, Memoria, Regni, the heart of the king is the memory of the kingdom. He understood then what Etienne had feared, that Louis Charles's consumption was not about pleasure. It was a method of preservation, a grotesque archive. Every person he devoured, every heart he tore from a body still warm, was a ledger, entry memories transferred, secrets captured, voices silenced by being stored within him. He was not eating to destroy, he was eating to possess. When the Marquis tried to bring his findings to the royal court, he was told the king was indisposed. When he returned to his estate, he found his wife staring blankly out the window, her hands bloody, her dress torn, and their 3 children gone. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, only a single card resting on the mantel, a black fleur-de-lis, and a single word, "Servi, served." He never spoke again. The revolution was coming, but it wasn't the revolution we were taught in school, not at first. The rage that bubbled in the streets of Paris wasn't only about hunger and taxes, it was fear, a collective dread that something beneath the surface had finally begun to rise. By 1789, Louis XVI sat on the throne, but his eyes, they weren't his own. Portraits painted in those final years are telling. His face is gaunt, his pupils dilated. The artist, Jocelyn David, reportedly abandoned a commission midway through, claiming that the king looked at me as though he knew what I tasted like. Even Marie Antoinette kept her distance. She hosted separate feasts. She stopped sleeping in the king's bed, and in her letters to her confidant in Austria, she referred to her husband not by name, but as the Hollow Man. Versailles emptied. The East Wing remained sealed, but the infection had already spread. That's when the death tolls began to surge, not from war or uprising, but from within the palace walls. Guards found dead in the corridors, their hearts removed with surgical precision. Cooks drowned in vats of wine. Pages vanished mid-message, leaving only the scent of ash and old perfume. And then, in the winter of that same year, the silence deepened. Every bell in Versailles stopped ringing. At once, no explanation, no wind, no sabotage, just a kind of unholy stillness, as if the palace itself had exhaled for the last time. Some say Louis Charles had returned, that his need for memory to be remembered grew as the dynasty's collapse approached. He would need new vessels, new mouths. The revolution may have stormed Versailles, but they never found him. They found opulence, records, letters, rotting, meat, and a chair deep in the East Wing's ruins, fused to the stone, human teeth embedded in the armrests. The feast was over, but not the hunger, because hunger, once awakened, becomes something else entirely. Centuries passed. The revolution swept through France like fire through a dry forest, toppling monarchs, smashing statues, and rewriting everything the court had once held sacred. The monarchy fell, heads rolled, blood ran through the cobbled streets of Paris, not just as justice, but as purge. And yet no record of him, no trial, no guillotine, no final account of Louis Charles d'Orléans. It was as if, when the palace was torn open, the heart of its darkest secret simply slipped through the cracks. But secrets like that don't die, they ferment. In 1963, a group of restoration workers were dispatched to the ruins beneath Versailles. The East Wing, long ignored, mostly collapsed, was scheduled to be reinforced, after an interior wall buckled unexpectedly. Beneath the dust and gilded rot, they uncovered something far older than the revolution. Tunnels, dozens of them, unmarked on any blueprint, hidden behind false panels, some no wider than a coffin, others wide enough to walk to abreast. What they found inside made headlines for a week. Then the story vanished. The initial reports were vague, historical debris, animal remains, ritual artifacts, but one man refused to let it go. His name was Julien Morin, an archivist from the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, a quiet man, not easily impressed, not easily rattled. He requested access to the tunnels under the pretense of cataloguing medieval burial practices. What he found nearly drove him mad. The first room was lined in bone, femurs, tibias, spines fused together into latticework, all cemented with a brownish mortar. Most bones were adult, a few too small, children, infants. But what chilled him wasn't the structure, it was the order. Everything was arranged in spiral-stite, mathematical spirals, echoing the golden ratio. A symmetry too deliberate to be dismissed as art. He proceeded deeper, passing a collapsed staircase and a wall scrawled in Latin etched, not in paint or soot, but in blood fused to the stone. A sample later revealed proteins consistent with human cardiac tissue. He found shelves of glass vials, sealed with wax. Inside, preserved hearts, each tagged with a name and date. Some dates stretched as far back as the early 1700s. One vial had no name, only a phrase, Il me souvient datos. I remember them all. Julien took 3 vials for study. He never submitted a report. His body was found weeks later, in his Paris flat, slumped over his desk. Cause of death, massive cardiac rupture. His heart had literally exploded. A grotesque coincidence, except for one detail: his chest showed no entry wound, but his ribcage was fractured inward, as though something inside had tried to escape. His notes were confiscated by the Ministry of Culture, officially lost in a fire. Unofficially, they were buried, but a copy survived hidden in microfilm, mislabeled, until it was rediscovered in 1999 by a graduate student named Claire Delorme. Claire was writing her thesis on anomalous death rituals in European nobility, and the file she stumbled upon didn't belong in any box. It contained sketches of the tunnels, diagrams of the spiral bone architecture, and chilling hypotheses from Julien Morin. One paragraph stood out: the arrangement of memory through the consumption of flesh may not be symbolic, it may be biological. The idea of ingesting a person to keep their essence is not folklore, it's cellular. The king was not a madman. He was an archivist, his body a library. Each organ consumed, a locked drawer. Each feast, a binding ritual. Claire, against all advice, published an abstract. Not in a major journal, no one would touch it, but on an obscure university forum. She detailed the evidence. A lost Bourbon prince, vanished from the record, but mentioned in dozens of private letters. Reports of missing persons near Versailles, spanning 3 centuries. A pattern of sealed archives, silenced researchers, and autopsies with inconclusive causes of death. The post went viral in academic circles. For a moment, the story resurfaced. The Cannibal King of France, mocked, dissected, sensationalized. But beneath the noise, a few historians noticed something uncanny. One historian from the Sorbonne found portraits of Louis XV and Louis XVI that appeared to share a peculiar anomaly. Slight asymmetry in the left eye, an imperfection not in the painting, but in the subject, repeated with eerie consistency, as though the same eye had passed from one skull to the next. Another researcher in Prague uncovered embalming notes from a royal surgeon, indicating that the heart of Louis XVI had been removed in secret hours before execution, not as a memento, but under orders from the Silent One. That phrase appeared in multiple documents: the silencio, always anonymous, always near death, always near power. And then Claire went missing. Her last known communication was an email, sent at 3:14 a.m. to a fellow researcher. They know I've seen it. They know I've told someone. If I disappear, he still lives. But if you tell them, he's forgotten. That's when he comes back. No body, no record of travel. Her apartment was found undisturbed except for the refrigerator. Every item inside was perfectly untouched, except the meat drawer, which was empty, and in its place a sealed vial. Inside, a human heart, warm. Still beating. What are we to make of this? A lost prince, a hidden archive of bones, a series of disappearances stretching over centuries. Science can only go so far. DNA testing on the preserved hearts was never completed. Samples were lost, laboratories burned. Witnesses retracted their statements. But if even a fraction of this story is true, then history has not been honest with us. Louis Charles d'Orléans may have been more than a madman. He may have discovered a method of extending memory, not life, but something worse, eternal awareness through consumption, and if he succeeded, his rituals endured then somewhere. Even now, there may be a man who walks among us, pale, quiet, watching. Not to kill, not to eat, but to preserve, because forgetting is death, but remembering is how he feeds. History is not made of dates. It's not carved in marble or stitched in flags. It breathes, it waits, it remembers, and sometimes it devours. The story of Louis Charles d'Orléans is not just about a lost prince, a forgotten chamber in Versailles, or the grotesque possibility of ritual cannibalism cloaked in royal silk. It's about us, about the fragile membrane between memory and identity, about what happens when we let certain histories go to silent. Too long, you see. Forgetting is easy. We forget the poor, the missing, the misdiagnosed. We erase the mad. We call stories like this folklore because it's easier than asking, what if it isn't? And what if it's not just the man we forgot? What if we've inherited his hunger? Look around. We live in a world addicted to consumption, not just of food, but of stories, of faces, of souls. We scroll, we absorb, we discard. We remember tragedy for a headline cycle, and then we move on. But the memory always remains somewhere. That's what Louis Charles understood. He knew that power wasn't held in gold or crowns. It was held in what people couldn't forget, in what they dared not speak aloud. And so, he fed, not for nourishment, but for immortality through recollection. The heart, after all, doesn't just pump blood. In ancient cultures, it was the seat of memory, of the soul, of the self. So he kept them, hundreds of them, maybe more. Each pulse, a name. Each name, a secret. Each secret, a weight no grave could contain. And those vials, the ones found beneath the palace, what were they really? Just trophies? Or were they backups? A hard drive of horrors, a blood-soaked archive, a way to remain long after his body crumbled. We still don't know what happened to Louis Charles. If he died, if he was killed, if he became something else. But in certain parts of France, the children still tell stories. They don't call him a king. They call him El Hamsans Fine, the man without hunger. Because that's the real terror, isn't it? Not a monster with a growling stomach, but one who never needs to eat again, and chooses to anyway, they say. He walks the roads after rain. That his face is kind but hollow. That he asks for names, not directions. That if you look too long into his eyes, you forget who you weren't. Remember something that was never yours to carry. In 2021, a viral TikTok video showed a man in antique French dress stepping onto the tracks at a metro station in Montparnasse. The footage was grainy, unclear, but his eyes, they glowed faintly, not with light, but with recognition, as if he saw you. 2 days later, the uploader deleted their account. Their message: I dreamt I was inside someone else's death, and then gone. It's easy to dismiss stories like this, but to many of the names connected to Louis Charles's legend, Etienne, Morin Delorme, even the anonymous children of Versailles, vanished, not just from life, but from history itself. No graves, no death records, just fragments, just fear. Which brings us back to the question we began with. Was there truly a king who ate hearts in secret chambers beneath a palace of gold? Was there a line of monarchs complicit in his rituals, dining not to nourish, but to preserve their power through absorption of the souls of those they ruled? Maybe, maybe not. But the truth is, some kings don't die in revolutions. Some kings live in the cracks of our minds, in the memories we've been taught to call fiction. And maybe, just maybe, that's the greatest feast of all. Because the more we tell this story, the more we bring him back, piece by piece, name by name, memory by memory. You've heard the tale now. You've seen what the history books refuse to print. And whether you believe it or not, you carry it. That's how he survives, and that's how he feeds. Cor Regis, Memoria. The heart of the king is the memory of the kingdom. So remember this. Not all thrones are made of gold. Some are made of bone. Not all kings wear crowns. Some wear our faces. And not all monsters want to be forgotten. Because the moment you forget is the moment he returns. And as the palace doors closed for the last time, a darker secret still remained. One not buried, not burned, only waiting.